My name is Thora Caldwell, and I am 68 years old. On the night of my birthday, my only son picked up the lemon cake I had baked from his father's recipe, held it in both hands the way you'd hold something you were about to hand someone, and dropped it on the hardwood floor instead. Cream cheese frosting spread across the planks I paid $47,000 to install. He looked down at it, then at me, and said 2 words. Eat it. His wife laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not the kind that slips out when a room goes wrong. A satisfied one. The kind you save for a moment you've been waiting on all night. Her mother smirked behind a wine glass like she'd been let in on something the rest of us hadn't. My granddaughter, 10 years old, started to cry, and nobody in that room moved to comfort her. I knelt down. I looked at every piece of that cake scattered across the floor. The batter Harold used to sift by hand. The lemon zest I'd grated that morning at 5 a.m. because my hands work best before the day gets away from me. I stood up. I picked up my purse. And I walked out of a house I had helped buy, through a door I had once paid to have rehung on its hinges. Nobody followed me. Nobody said stop. Nobody said anything at all. He said 2 words. 2 words that cost him everything. By the next morning, every account, every property, every dollar with my name quietly attached to it was gone. Not stolen, not lost. Moved. By me. And none of them understood why, because none of them had ever bothered to ask what, exactly, my name had been holding up all these years. I want to tell you how a woman kneels on a kitchen floor at 68 years old, picks herself back up without a word, and walks straight into the rest of her life like she already knew this moment was coming. Because I did. I just never thought it would be my own son who finally made me use what I'd been carrying, quietly, for 25 years. I live alone now in a 1-bedroom apartment in Dayton, Ohio, that smells like lemon zest and dish soap. Bills filed by date. Spices lined up in alphabetical order. 32 years as a senior loan officer at First National Bank does that to a person. You stop trusting things that aren't written down. Harold and I were married 33 years before his heart gave out at 63. He was the kind of man who replaced a faucet 2 weeks before it would have leaked, who noticed the soft spot in the porch before anyone's foot ever went through it. He didn't wait for a problem to announce itself. I suppose I learned that from him, or maybe I taught it to him first. Either way, we spent our whole marriage staying 1 step ahead of disaster. And it worked mostly, until his heart stopped keeping up with the rest of him. We raised 1 son, Marcus. And from the day he left our house to build his own life, I made sure he never had to build it alone, even when he never asked me to help. I co-signed his first mortgage when the bank he worked for wouldn't take his income seriously. I guaranteed 2 business loans when his contracting company nearly folded in its 2nd year. I paid for the kitchen renovation that later became the centerpiece of every dinner party he never invited me to. I covered 3 years of my granddaughter's private school tuition because Marcus said it would only be for a little while. 25 years. Nearly $500,000 all told, moving quietly out of my accounts and into his life, 1 signature at a time. I never asked him to thank me for any of it. I didn't do it to be thanked. I did it because that's what you do when you spent 3 decades watching families lose everything over 1 missed payment. And you have both the means and the memory to make sure it never happens to your own child. She saved for 32 years. They spent like it was always coming. I kept a record of it anyway, not because I doubted my son, but because 32 years in banking teaches you that memory fades and paper doesn't. Every loan, every co-signature, every dollar went into a leather notebook I bought at a stationery shop the same month Harold died. I told myself it was habit. Old instinct from the job. Not distrust. I didn't know yet how much that habit would matter. What I did know, even then, standing at my kitchen counter writing down another number in that notebook, was that somewhere along the way, my son and his wife had stopped seeing what I gave as help. They had started seeing it as something they were simply owed. The first crack was small enough that I almost didn't notice it. Marcus and his wife, Vanessa, planned a family trip to Michigan for the 4th of July, and the plans moved through a group text I wasn't added to until 3 days before they left. When I mentioned it, Vanessa said it must have been an oversight, that she'd assumed someone else had included me. I told myself that was probably true. People forget things when they're busy. Then came the sunroom. The renovation I'd paid for 2 years earlier, the one that turned a sagging back porch into the room where Marcus said he did his best thinking, got repainted and refurnished one weekend while I was visiting my sister in Cincinnati. Vanessa posted photos online calling it our little glow-up, tagging a designer, thanking her mother for helping pick the paint. Nobody thanked me for the $41,000 that made the room possible in the first place. I told myself that decorating wasn't the same as ownership, and that maybe I was being sensitive about a color swatch. Then, at a neighborhood barbecue I wasn't invited to but heard about secondhand, Marcus told a group of new co-workers that he and Vanessa had bought the house themselves, right after he got promoted. Not a word about the mortgage I'd co-signed when the bank wouldn't take his income seriously. Not a word about the 3 years I'd covered before his credit could stand on its own. I called Dolores that night. We'd worked the loan desk together for 11 years before she retired, and she had never once been afraid to say the thing everyone else was thinking. "Thora," she said, "they've stopped seeing you as the reason any of this exists." I laughed it off, told her Marcus was busy, that Vanessa had a lot on her plate with the girls' schedules, that families forget to say thank you sometimes and it doesn't mean anything. Dolores didn't laugh with me. Busy people forget who paid for the roof over their heads. I told myself later, alone in my kitchen, trying to make the sentence sound reasonable. It didn't sound reasonable. It sounded like something I was saying to keep from saying something else. I want to be fair here. None of these things on their own meant much. A missed text. A repainted room. A story told wrong at a barbecue I wasn't at to correct. Any one of them could be explained away by a woman who wanted, badly, to believe her son still saw her the way she saw him. But 3 of them, stacked one on top of the other in the space of a single summer, started to form a shape I recognized from 32 years of watching people's finances tell the truth long before their mouths did. I just didn't know yet how much further that shape was going to stretch. The Sunday after Labor Day, Marcus asked me to come by for dinner. I remember thinking, foolishly, that it might be an apology for the barbecue story, or at least an invitation to the next family trip. Instead, Vanessa slid a folder across the table before the plates were even cleared. Inside was a document from a title company, drawn up to remove my name from the deed on their house. Vanessa called it a simplification. She said it would make things easier down the road. Easier for the girls, easier for everyone, if the paperwork only reflected the people who actually lived there. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask why now, or why like this over dinner. With a folder that had clearly been prepared before I ever walked through the door, I set my fork down, looked at the document, and asked one question. Simplify what exactly? Nobody answered right away. Vanessa glanced at Marcus. Marcus looked at his plate. The silence went on a beat longer than it should have for a question that simple. And I let it sit there, because in 32 years of reading loan applications, I learned that silence after a plain question tells you more than most people's answers ever do. Marcus finally said that it wasn't anything personal, that they just wanted things settled properly, in case something happened to me down the line, so the estate wouldn't get complicated. He said it gently, the way you'd say something you'd rehearsed, and I understood in that moment that this conversation had been planned before I arrived and had nothing to do with simplifying anything for my sake. I told them I'd think about it. I thanked Vanessa for dinner. I drove home with the folder still sitting on their table, and signed, and I did not raise my voice once, not in that dining room and not in my car afterward, though I will tell you it took most of the drive to keep my hands steady on the wheel. What none of them understood, sitting at that table, was that the deed was the smallest piece of what actually connected me to that house. There was a mortgage guarantee behind it that only I could release, a repayment structure on the tuition money that only I had ever tracked, and a business loan tied to Marcus's contracting company that still carried my signature as much as his. They thought they were asking me to sign away a formality. They had no idea they were asking me to give up the only leverage that had been quietly holding their entire life together for 25 years. I didn't say any of that at the table. I simply asked my question, watched the silence answer it for me, and drove home to sit with what I now understood for certain. That this had stopped being a misunderstanding a long time ago. 3 days after my birthday, my phone buzzed with a text that wasn't meant for me. Vanessa had meant to send it to her mother. Instead, an old group thread from the sunroom renovation pulled my name back into the chain, and her message landed on my screen before she ever realized her mistake. I read it once, standing at my kitchen counter with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. It laid out a timeline. How fast they could get my name off the mortgage once she's out of the picture. Which accounts still needed my signature removed. A mention of a lawyer Vanessa's mother knew. Someone who could move things along quietly, once I stopped being an obstacle. And near the bottom, in the same casual tone you'd use to plan a grocery list, a line about the birthday dinner. How it might be the moment to finally make her understand where she stands. I read it a second time, slower, the way I used to read loan files when a number didn't sit right the first time through. I wanted to be certain I wasn't imagining what was in front of me. I wasn't. The cake on the floor hadn't been a moment of frustration boiling over. It had been a decision, discussed and timed, meant to push me somewhere I would stay pushed. The 2 words my son said to me that night hadn't come from nowhere. They had come from a plan that existed before I ever walked through his door with a cake in my hands. I want to tell you I screamed, or cried, or threw the phone across the room. I didn't. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd once helped Marcus with his algebra homework, and I let the quiet settle over me the way it does when a number finally adds up to something you didn't want it to. Then I made one phone call. Not to Marcus. Not to Vanessa. To a woman named Diane Whitfield, an attorney I'd known since she handled the paperwork on Harold's estate 8 years earlier. I asked her, calmly, whether she had time to meet with me this week. She said she did. I didn't tell her why not yet. I only said it was about some old documents I needed looked at. After I hung up, I placed my phone face down in the kitchen drawer where I kept spare batteries and rubber bands, and I left it there for the rest of the night. They believed my age made me forgetful. It had only ever made me thorough. For 25 years, I had been the person in that family who read every document before signing it, who tracked every dollar in a leather notebook out of nothing more than habit. They had mistaken that habit for harmlessness. They assumed a woman who quietly wrote numbers in a notebook was simply sentimental, keeping a scrapbook of the family's good fortune. They never once considered that the notebook might also be a record of exactly how much control I still held over the life they thought belonged entirely to them. I sat at that table a long while after the phone went dark in the drawer, and for the first time since the cake hit the floor, I did not feel humiliated. I felt exactly like I did the day I was handed my first loan file at 26 years old. Calm, clear-eyed, and already 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room. What Marcus and Vanessa never understood, in all those years of thank you cards left unwritten and stories told wrong at barbecues, was that I never gave anything away carelessly. 32 years in banking teaches you that generosity without structure is just a debt waiting to be forgotten. And I had spent too long watching families lose everything to leave my own son's future to memory and good faith alone. The house wasn't simply something I'd helped with. When the mortgage lender balked at Marcus's income in his first year, I hadn't just co-signed as a formality. I'd structured it with a co-ownership clause, drawn up quietly at the time, that kept my name tied to the property as more than a guarantor of convenience. The business loans that saved his contracting company weren't casual favors either. I'd required a personal guarantee that gave me recall rights if certain conditions weren't met. Conditions that included things like honesty about the state of the finances I was underwriting, and the tuition money for my granddaughters, the renovations. Every dollar that moved from my accounts into their lives over 25 years had a repayment structure behind it, documented in a plain leather notebook with dates, amounts, and signatures Marcus himself had provided at the time, thinking, I imagine, that it was simply his mother being particular. I never corrected their assumption that all of it was a gift. I let them believe it, year after year, because peace in the family mattered more to me than being thanked properly, and because Harold always said that keeping score out loud was the fastest way to turn love into a ledger. So I kept my ledger quiet instead. I kept it in a drawer, in a notebook, in clauses buried inside documents nobody but me had ever bothered to read twice. She had never been generous by accident. She had been generous on paper. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. I did not spend 25 years secretly plotting a way to take everything back from my son. That was never the plan. The plan, if you could call it that, was simply to protect myself the way any responsible person protects themselves when they extend that much trust to someone they love. I structured things properly because that is what 32 years of watching other people's carelessness taught me to do. Not because I ever expected to need it. But I did need it now. And for the first time since the cake hit that hardwood floor, I understood exactly what I was capable of doing about it. The first step wasn't anger. It wasn't a phone call to Marcus, or a confrontation with Vanessa, or even one more sleepless night turning the text message over in my mind. The first step was simple, quiet, and entirely within the boundaries of paper I had already signed a long time ago. I picked up the phone the next morning and called Diane Whitfield again. This time to tell her exactly what I needed her to look at, and exactly what I suspected those documents still allowed me to do. Diane's office hadn't changed much since the week we settled Harold's estate. Same law books on the shelf, same steady way of listening before she spoke. I brought the leather notebook and the folder of loan documents, and I set them both on her desk without a word of preamble. She read for nearly 20 minutes while I sat across from her, saying nothing, letting her get to the same conclusions I already suspected on my own. When she finally looked up, she confirmed what I'd hoped and feared in equal measure. The co-signed mortgage did carry a clause allowing me to call the guarantee if the terms of trust underlying it had been materially violated, and given what I'd shown her, she believed that threshold had been met. The business loan guarantee was even more straightforward. It could be called at my discretion, in writing, effective within a defined notice period. And the tuition repayment structure, the one Marcus had signed almost without reading all those years ago, was enforceable exactly as written. Legally, she said, you have more control here than most people would ever guess from the outside. I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't expected. Not triumph exactly. Something closer to relief. The relief of a number finally confirmed instead of merely suspected. Diane didn't stop there though. She leaned back and told me, carefully, that having the right to act wasn't the same as knowing when to use it. If I moved now this week, right on the heels of the birthday and the message I'd seen, any reasonable person looking from the outside could call it vindictive. A mother humiliated at a party, retaliating in anger. It wouldn't matter that every document I held predated that humiliation by years. Timing shapes how these things are read, in a courtroom and everywhere else. You don't need anger, Mrs. Caldwell, she said. You need timing. I asked her the only question that mattered to me at that point. The same kind of question I used to ask junior loan officers when they brought me a file they thought was ready to close. What has to happen on their end before the timing works in my favor instead of against me? Diane smiled, just slightly, the way people do when they realize they're not explaining something to someone who needs it explained twice. She told me that if Marcus or Vanessa made any move that touched those same accounts, any request for a loan modification, any attempt to draw against the business line, any change to those properties, that action alone would establish the record I needed far better than my own outrage ever could. So I did the only thing that made sense to a woman who had spent 32 years reading the fine print before anyone else in the room. I thanked Diane, gathered my folder, and went home to wait. I didn't have to wait long. 3 weeks passed, and I said nothing to Marcus or Vanessa about the deed, the birthday, or the message I was never meant to see. I answered their calls the way I always had. I asked about the girls' schoolwork. I let the silence between us feel, from their side of it, like something settling rather than something sharpening. Word came back to me through my sister, the way family news always does, that Vanessa had told relatives I'd finally accepted my place in things, that I understood the house and the future belonged to the next generation now, and that I wasn't going to make things difficult about the deed after all. Marcus, apparently, had started telling people I was mellowing with age. They took that mellowing as an opening. Within the month, they'd applied for a home equity loan against the property, planning renovations to the very sunroom I'd already paid for once, financing it against a house whose mortgage terms still required my signature to modify anything of significance. Vanessa mentioned it casually at a family dinner I wasn't at but heard about later, framing it as something already settled, a detail barely worth discussing. They mistook my silence for surrender. It was only ever preparation. While they made plans against a house they didn't fully understand the terms of, I drove to my old branch of First National one Tuesday morning, sat with a banker half my age who had no idea he was looking at 32 years of institutional memory across the desk from him, and confirmed quietly the exact standing of every account and guarantee still carrying my name. Afterward, I called Diane and asked her to confirm a date. Not a date for anger. A date for notice. The loan application did what Diane said it would. It required my signature on a document tied to a mortgage I still legally controlled. And for the first time in 25 years, my son's plans could not move 1 inch further without my name on a page. Marcus called me himself, 2 days after the application was submitted, sounding lighter than he had in months, asking if I could just come by and sign a few things so the renovation could get started before winter. I told him I'd think about it, the same words I'd used the night they slid that folder across the dinner table. And this time, when I hung up the phone, I wasn't thinking about how to keep the peace. I was thinking about the exact wording Diane and I had settled on for the notice that was about to change everything they thought they understood about the woman who raised him. I didn't go to sign anything. Instead, on a Thursday morning in October, 3 formal notices went out under Diane's letterhead, delivered the way these things are always delivered when the timing has finally been done right. The first revoked my guarantee on the mortgage, effective per the terms I'd signed 25 years earlier. The ones tucked inside the co-ownership clause nobody in that family had ever thought to read twice. The second called the business loan due in full, exercising the recall rights built into the personal guarantee I'd required back when Marcus's contracting company was 2 months from folding. The third activated the repayment clause on the tuition funds, the one logged faithfully in a leather notebook alongside his own signature, given without complaint at the time because he never imagined it would matter. Marcus called within the hour, his voice doing the thing voices do when someone is certain there's been a mistake. He said there must be some error, that I couldn't just call in decades of family help like it was a business transaction, that this wasn't how any of this worked. I let Diane's office field the call after that. I had nothing to add. His attorney, a young man who sounded like he'd never once had a client's mother produce 25 years of documented, signed, dated proof of exactly what she was owed, called Diane the next day expecting to find a bluff, or at best a misunderstanding he could talk his way around. Diane walked him through it clause by clause, calmly, the way you'd explain something to someone who genuinely hadn't known what they were dealing with. The mortgage guarantee, the business loan terms, the tuition repayment structure. Every signature, every date, every dollar accounted for exactly where it needed to be. There was nothing to argue with. There never had been. It had all been sitting there, legal and enforceable, for 25 years, waiting for a reason to be used. They expected pleading. She brought documentation. I heard, secondhand, that Vanessa cried when she understood what the notices actually meant for the house, for the loan they'd just applied for the sunroom they thought they were about to expand. I heard Marcus went quiet for 2 full days, the kind of quiet that comes when a person realizes the ground they'd been standing on was never entirely theirs to begin with. I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have expected. I didn't feel much of anything close to victory. What I felt, mostly, was the strange calm of a number finally closing out correctly after years of sitting unresolved on a ledger somewhere in the back of my mind. There was one more piece of paper I hadn't sent yet. Diane had asked me twice if I wanted to include it with the others, and twice I told her not yet. It sat in a plain envelope on the corner of her desk, the kind of envelope that doesn't look like much of anything until someone finally opens it. I told her I wanted to deliver that one myself. I went back to Diane's office the following Monday, the notebook in my bag the way it had ridden along with me for 8 years, through grocery runs and doctor's appointments and every ordinary errand that gave no hint of what it was actually carrying. Diane had the coffee ready before I sat down, the same way she always did, as if she understood by now that our meetings had stopped being about paperwork and started being about something closer to closing a very long account. I set the notebook on her desk and opened it to a page I'd marked years earlier with a torn strip of paper, back when I never imagined I'd need to find it again this quickly. Diane leaned forward and read it the way she read everything, slowly, without comment, until she reached the bottom and looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Something between respect and quiet surprise. Beside the notebook, I placed a sealed envelope, addressed plainly to the bank that handled Marcus's business account. The same bank where I'd once trained 3 of their current branch managers back when I still carried a badge and a desk of my own. "This needs to go out today," I told her. Not tomorrow. Today. Diane didn't ask what was inside it. She'd learned, over these last few weeks, that I didn't hand her anything without already knowing exactly what it would do once it landed. She simply nodded, picked up the notebook, and turned back to the marked page one more time to confirm the figures before she made the call that would set everything in motion. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happens next, or rather, before I tell you that I'm not going to tell you what happens next. Not yet. Every step I've described to you so far, the guarantee, the loan recall, the tuition clause, all of it was simply me protecting what had always legally been mine to protect. What sat inside that envelope was different. It wasn't about protecting anything anymore. It was about the last piece of information Marcus's company had never known I possessed. Something buried in the original loan structure from the day I first guaranteed his business. Back when he was 29 years old and terrified his contracting company would fold before it ever got off the ground. I had kept that page quiet for 16 years. Not out of cruelty. Out of the same instinct that made me keep the whole notebook in the first place. The belief that some things are only worth using if you never have to. Diane reached for the phone on her desk. The receiver already halfway to her ear. Waiting on me for one final confirmation before she made the call. I looked at her. Calm the way I had been calm on my kitchen floor the night the cake hit the hardwood. Calm the way I had been calm across from Vanessa when she slid that folder toward me. Calm the way 32 years of reading other people's numbers had taught me to be when everything finally added up to exactly what I'd always suspected it would. Page 7, I said. Diane picked up the phone. Somewhere across town, a business account was about to learn exactly who had been holding it up the whole time.